Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. If you did not know, we are in the midst of a end-of-the-year 7-week special series with Dr. J. Smith. Of course, last week in part 4 of the series, talking about the myth of the Andalusian paradise, I had Dr. Daniel Janostic with me, and that was a huge blessing. If you didn't see that episode or the episodes before that, please go to the Trinity channel's YouTube channel. You'll be able to find the videos there. You can also find them on Fander Films, which is Dr. J. Smith's YouTube channel as well. And you can also find them on my Vimeo channel, vimeo.com/Tony Gourlay. And now for part 5, we have Dr. Smith back once again. Today, we're talking about a very vital topic that a lot of people are not aware of when it comes to the history of Islam. We're talking about the hidden Islamic slave trade. Dr. Smith, it's great to see you again. Thank you once again for coming back to Colliding Worldviews.
Tony, thank you. It's good to be back here again. And yeah, you're right. This is a very controversial subject. It is a subject that has been around for hundreds of years, yet no one has talked about it. And I think why it's important, Tony, when you go and if you look at any of our textbooks, if you look at any of our courses on history, especially about the history of the slave trade, there's been only one slave trade. The only narrative that's out there, Tony, is the slave trade concerning the transatlantic slave trade. And because of that, that's the only narrative we've been taught. It's the only narrative we've grown up. We know that hundreds and hundreds of Afro-Americans have become Muslims because of this notion that Christianity, because the assumption is Christianity was responsible for that slave trade. These were Christian nations. These were European nations. And it's because of that European flavor, that Christian flavor, that slavery is unique to Christianity, that slavery is unique to the European continent, and therefore Islam has nothing to answer for slavery. That's what I've been taught, and that's what you're hearing. And when I did my master's thesis in America, I went up and down the East Coast, to Baltimore, to Washington. I went to New York. I went as far up as Montreal, up in Canada. And I went to mosques. My thesis was on what is the attraction of Islam. And right at the top of the list for those who had converted to Islam, because almost the entire number of people that I was able to talk to were Afro-Americans. This came up over and over again. One of the reasons why they accepted Islam and rejected Christianity was because they believed, and they had always been told, and they assumed that this was correct, that slavery was a Christian problem. Slavery was endemic to in the Bible. Slavery has only been imposed on Africans by Christians. And that Islam was the answer. Islam was their religion. It was a black man's religion. It was a religion that has no racism. It was a religion that had no slavery. There is no slavery history in Islam. And that was the attraction. And I remember thinking this through. I said, that can't be right. That is not right. I know that I've heard lots of references, but you know, there's no book out there. There's nothing that has been written on this. Now, on my team is a girl named Sarah Foster. Sarah Foster, and you can go up on the Fander YouTube and just look a year and a half ago. That's what we're all talking about. Over a year and a half ago, she and I went down to Speaker's Corner. Sarah Foster is a descendant of slaves. Her slave history comes from Jamaica. She's a Jamaican. Her mother is a historian on slavery. She has been brought up her whole life hearing this narrative about the slave trade and about her past, and her whole identity has been wrapped up in this idea that she is a product of that European slave trade, that transatlantic slave trade. So she'd always assumed, therefore, that there was only one story, there was only one narrative, until she came across a number of books, one's written by Lovejoy, another written by Austin, and particularly another doctoral thesis written by Dr. John Azuma. Dr. John Azuma is from Ghana. He was troubled by his own history. He knew that his family had been involved in the slave trade, that they were actually slavers. And so he wanted to do his doctoral thesis on this. He had been a Muslim. He had converted to Christianity. And as a Christian, he realized that he has an awful lot to look into. He has an awful lot from his own family background concerning us. And he was the first one that I'm aware of that actually went back to the documents, went back to the original documents. Now, Tony, what we've been doing through all these 7 series is looking at the history the historical critique, looking and seeing what the documents say concerning the history of the emergence of Islam, the history of the Quran, and now the history of slavery. So that's why we're now in this fifth segment, now tying it all into that historical fabric. We're going to do today what Dr. John Azuma did. He decided, rather than just hear this narrative that he's been brought up there with there in Ghana, that slavery only went from the west coast of Africa. And as we're talking, I'd like the technician to put up slide number 19. Look at the map that is there. And I want you, Tony, to look at this map and tell me what you see when you look at this map. When you look at that map, that's the map that we're shown all the time. Have you noticed? Take a look at that map and what do you see? Just off the top of your head, what are some of the first things you come up with?
We see a lot of the, excuse me, a lot of the lines going in some ridiculous directions there. We have the east coast of Africa heading south, like or Cape Town, South Africa area, all the way up heading towards Mexico. And we just have some interesting lineage here, or the way these lines are pointed for the most part.
So let's keep that map up there. I wanted to take a look at it. And you brought up something that most people don't see, or most people haven't. There's no reason not to see this. This is the map. This is just, I just took this off the internet. This is just a typical map of the slave routes. And you notice almost all the slave routes are coming off of West Africa, the green lines. In fact, even on the east coast of Africa, as you notice, and this is something that most people don't pick up, you noticed it right away. Even the east coast, these are places like Lambu, and this is places like Zanzibar. You've heard about the island of Zanzibar. Enormous amounts of history that's come out of the islands of Zanzibar. And yet, take a look and see where they have the lines going. They have them going around the Cape of South Africa. Ships couldn't go around that cape. No ships went around that cape. It was much too dangerous to send ships there because of the huge crashing storms they have there in South Africa. So that map is a lie. What's more, it looks like there's only about 2 or 3 lines on the east coast of Africa. And look on the west coast, 10, 20 lines going out of the west coast. Well, it looks like all the trade was from the west coast of Africa. Now, this reason why I'm showing this map at the very beginning is when you look at that map, you will see some lines going up to the north of Africa. Do you see those? They look brown in what I'm looking at. They're actually red. But those red lines going up North Africa, no one's talked about those lines. And most curiously, no one's talked about the East Coast African slave. Now, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to show what the statistics are, and we're going to show that these have been the lie that we're getting all the time. I want the technician to put up the next slide, which is also part of 19, looking at the total slaves who left Africa. I want to look at that graph there, because we've got a graph to show you what the numbers are. And this is the numbers you've not heard before. Now, take a look at those numbers. And I've circled 2 different numbers. In green, I have 17 million. That's the number of slaves that left East Coast and North Coast, the North Coast of Africa and the East Coast of Africa. That is the Islamic number of slaves. Sorry, let me repeat that. Let me re-say that again. That's the trans-Saharan African North. That's only the number of slaves that left the North to go up through the trans-Saharan, 17 million. Look at the number that left the West Coast, what we know as the transatlantic slave trade. And you see that number is 11.7. So we do know the number that left West Africa. We even know where they went to. We know that they went to, well, the Americas. And that from the map that we see above that, you can see that they went to Brazil, and they went to the Dominican Republic, they went to Haiti. They went to my country, to America. We know, and here's what's also interesting, of the slaves that left West Africa and went to the Americas, we've always been told that almost all of them came to America, North America, United States. What John Azuma found by looking at the trading documents was that only 5% came to North America. 95% of the transatlantic slave trade went to Brazil and went to Central America and primarily the Caribbean, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, all those islands that are in the Caribbean. That's where 95% of the slaves went to. Now, here's the other big lie that we've not been told of. 17 million went up through the trans-Saharan. Where are the numbers for the East African slaves? Dr. John Azuma said that it could be as many as 3 to 4 million that went from the East Coast. You add that up together, and that's anywhere from, well, let's start with 17 million, going right up to 21 million. There could be as many as 21 million slaves that left the East Coast of Africa and went across the Sahara, the north part of Africa. Where did those slaves go to, Tony?
Well, we see them going east. We don't see them coming to North America. We don't see them going to Mexico or to South America.
Don't look at that map anymore. You know that that map is a lie. You can't even look at that map. We've already disputed that. There's no way any of them could have come south.
I'm sorry. So I'm talking about the politically correct public school map that we have here that we showed first.
It's the only map that's out there, actually. That's the only map you're going to see. And that's why we're having this program. We're showing that the history of the slave trade has only been one history. And that was, as we're going to see later on, Bernard Lewis, who is probably the one that has done the most work on this from Princeton University. He has said that even this history was created after the Enlightenment to attack Christianity. But before we get into that quote, let's just go ahead and let's ask, can you see from that map, can you see from the statistics that the vast majority of slaves went from the east coast of Africa and the north coast of Africa, and they all went up to the north? And they all went to the Muslim world. Now, why have we not been told that? Why is it that Sarah Foster had to go do the research on this? She is the one that's put this all together. What we're going to do today is look at her research. And we're going to look and we're going to bring up some very inflammatory items from her material. So let's get right into it. Let's go. But I wanted to bring that up there. And then I want you to turn now, if our technician could, to take us to slide number 20. Because we're going to look at the Islamic slave raids versus the transatlantic slave raids. Just look at that graph up there, doing a comparison to start off. This is what we've been known, and this is what's fascinating. When you, in America especially, most of our view of slavery came from a book called Roots, put out by Alex Haley, and came out from the documentary that he put out from that book. And at the opening sequence of that documentary, those who have watched it, I imagine many who are watching today had watched that documentary. There was this scenario of Europeans coming into a village with cutlasses and destroying the village and taking all the people in chains. That the Europeans were the ones that actually enslaved the Africans. When Dr. Alex Haley wrote this up, and when he had done his documentary, different researchers in the University of Chicago confronted him on that and says, do you know of any documented case where this happened? And he could not come up with any documented case. But this is the only narrative he had heard, and this is the narrative that we have all been taught, that the slavery of Africans was done by Europeans. There's not been one documented case of any Europeans enslaving anybody. Now, that's fascinating. What's more, the slave trade existed over 1,000 years before the Europeans ever got into it. And what they have found now, and this is what Dr. John Azuma found, this is what also Lovejoy and Austin, they all found. These are the ones who've done the most work on this. They have all found that the slavery was done by Africans against other Africans. It was one tribe warring against another tribe, taking that tribe, bringing them into slavery, and then selling them to the Arabs. And the Arabs have always been a part of the slave trade. It was the Arabs that were there buying those slaves, putting them into chains, and then taking them up to the north across the Sahara. And the Muslims have been involved in that since the 7th century. That slave trade then was then introduced to the Europeans by the Arabs in 1400s. So for 700 years, the Muslims engaged and controlled and dominated the slave trade. It was only in the 1400s, 700 years later, that the Europeans started engaging in the slave trade. So for 700 years, this had been uniquely a Muslim slave trade. We've not been told that. What was interesting is the Europeans could not even go on the mainland because there were so many diseases on the mainland of Africa, and they didn't have resistance to these diseases. The Arabs were from that area. They lived there for centuries. They've been going up and down trading with the Africans. So they would bring the slaves out to islands on the coast. That's why when you go to Senegal, I lived in Senegal for 5 years. When you go to Senegal, just off the coast of Senegal is an island called Gorée. That was a slave island. That's where all the slaves from the west coast would come up, from the west coast of Senegal, would come up, and they would take them out by ship out to the islands, and the Europeans would come down to that island and buy the slaves at that island, but not on the mainland. So that's why there's no documented cases of any Europeans getting involved in any slavery. They never enslaved anybody. They bought the slaves from the Muslims, and always from the Muslims. We've known this, really, but no one's bothered to talk about it. Now, they were involved in that slave trade. Now, let's just look at that graph there. When you look at the Islamic slave trade rates and you compare it with the transatlantic slave trade, we know anywhere from 17 to 20 million slaves left the east coast and the north coast of Africa to go to the Islamic world, to go to the Muslim world. On the other side, the transatlantic slave trade was anywhere from 11 to 12 million, so much smaller and a much shorter time period. The Islamic slave trade still exists today. And we know that it still exists today. In fact, Tony, you've got some pictures that you'd like to show us that this slavery still exists today, does it not? We were talking about it last night. Go ahead and express what you now know about the slave trade that's continuing even today.
Well, the thing is that a lot of people, they hear about sex trafficking. And of course, that is a very unfortunate activity that is still taking place. But what people are not aware of is that slavery is still happening in many countries, still as much today as it did much long ago. And actually, I have some pictures here that we want to show. And pictures of modern day slavery in Libya. And as you'll see here, you'll see that this is still going on. These are very unfortunate, heartbreaking pictures that we're seeing. We have about 7 different pictures here that we're going to show you. And all of these are more recent photos. Now, CNN came out with a news story saying, oh, CNN exposes modern day slavery or whatever. I put on Facebook, my Facebook page, just look, they need to change their name to JCL, Johnny Come Latelys, because this has been going on for a whole long time. This isn't just a recent thing that's been happening. And even like in countries like Mauritania, where in Saudi Arabia, where slavery was just recently outlawed, say within the last maybe 20 years at the most. And that doesn't mean, okay, let's cut it off and it doesn't happen anymore. It is still happening. What we're saying is that within the last 20 years, there is different Islamic countries that finally said, okay, we guess this is wrong, publicly at least. But as we see, very, very unfortunate pictures that are coming out of Africa here.
Tony, just to back you up on what you're saying, Baroness Cox, who's a good friend of mine, I've worked with her, I've worked for her in the last 25 years that I was in England. Baroness Cox, back in the early part of this century, so around 2000 to 2003, she went down to the Sudan, she went down to Mauritania, and she went down to Mali. And she went to slave markets in those countries and took a film crew with her and bought slaves on film to show that this is still going on only in Muslim countries today. She then freed the slaves on camera. That caused a huge furore in Britain. And in fact, there were some people that even said because she bought so many slaves and then freed them, it actually inflated the prices of the slaves in those markets. And so she had to stop doing it because she was actually, with the monies that she was infusing into that market, was inflating the prices. Now, she did it for one very important reason. This lie that Muslims have been saying that slavery does not exist anymore, that this is only a Christian problem and this is only a Western problem. She wanted to shut that lie down. But as you say, if you look at the dates when slavery was eradicated, the abolition of slavery has only been done by Christians. The abolition of slavery was created by a group of people called the Clapham sect there in Britain. And look at the date. It was William Wilberforce who was then influenced by the Clapham sect, who was part of the Clapham sect. The Clapham sect was made up mainly of Quakers. Quakers are Christians. And the reason that the Quakers were confronting slavery was because of the Bible. They were looking at verses like Galatians 3:28, for there is no difference between man or woman, slave or Greek, Jew or Gentile. All are equal in Jesus Christ. They were looking at verses like Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, which says that we are all made in God's image. That means man, woman, Jew, Greek, slave, or free are all made in God's image. And primarily they were going to Philemon verse 16, where Paul sends back a slave to the master, to Philemon, and he says to the master, I'm sending him back to you. He is the slave that ran away. I'm sending him back to you, but you are no longer master to slave. You are now brothers in Christ, redefining the whole relationship between slave and master as brother in Christ. And that's why the Clapham sect used it and confronted it. That's why William Wilberforce, his whole career, was engaged in confronting slavery. And that's why finally in 1807, slavery was eradicated. Technically, it was eradicated in Britain. That did not really happen until around the 1830s, when it was finally, because it took an awful long time to confront and stop the slavery from down. Now, once it happened in Britain, it then had a rippling effect right across Europe. We had a war against slavery here in the United States, the Civil War in the 1860s, 50s and 60s, and that's why it then moved right across the rest of the Western world. Take a look at the last two countries to eradicate slavery. Saudi Arabia in 1960 and Mauritania in 1981. So the last countries to actually abolish slavery were Muslim countries. What's fascinating, the only reason they abolished slavery was because the United Nations forced them to. They did not do it out of their own volition. And that's something that Muslims need to answer to, that Islam needs to come forward and admit that they are the only countries that were forced to eradicate slavery. Now, let's go back then to this graph that we had earlier.
Dr. Smith,
slide number
Dr. Smith,
20.
right before you do that, let me go ahead and show, just following up on what you just said, a few more pictures, and then we want to get back to your graph. This is a picture here from my Facebook page where I have actually some links to YouTube videos that people can go to. As you just said, you know, these certain countries, okay, they then outlawed it because of the pressure from the United Nations. These URL links that are right here, these are from past months, not just, you know, breaking CNN news story, oh, slavery still happening today. These are actually YouTube videos you can go to, you can watch, that were filmed 5 years ago, sometimes more, of this slavery that is still taking place. And people can see all this here. Of course, too, the other pictures that we can show you here real quick, these are actually pictures of books that you can get that talk about the Islamic slave trade. And actually one of them is one that, Dr. Smith, that you reference in this PDF that we're going through right now, a book by Bernard Lewis. But here are just some quick photos of some books that you might want to get more information about this Islamic slave trade that, again, is not found in the politically correct public school system or anything like that. Get these books. You're going to get a lot more information that we can actually go through on this episode of Colliding Worldviews. Dr. Smith.
Okay, let's go back then to slide number 20, and let's do a comparison, because this is where it gets very controversial, and this is where, when we have introduced this in the past, Muslims have got very angry with us. Rightly so. If I were a Muslim, I would get angry too, because when you do a comparison of the two slave trades, listen, we have absolutely Europeans and Christians have admitted that slavery did exist in the transatlantic slave trade. It existed from 1400 to 1800. What we have not looked at is the slavery that took place from the 7th century and still exists even today. For 1400 years, Islam has been involved in the slave trade. Why haven't we been told that? And why has this not been put into our history books? And why is this not being taught in our schools? And especially, why is this not taught to the Afro-American community and the Afro-Caribbean community? That they need to hear the real historical record. Now, when you look at that graph there, what was fascinating, when you look at the Islamic slave raids, They were interested in mostly women. 2 out of every 3 slaves were women. On the other side, the transatlantic slave trade, 2 out of every 3 slaves were men. Why is this? Why was the Arabs only interested in women and the Europeans mostly interested in men? The reason is very simple. The Europeans needed the slaves for their, they needed it for their, what is it, where you have, I can't even think of the name off the top of my head, where you have plantations, for the huge plantations in Brazil and in Haiti. They need them for work. These plantations had an enormous amount of trees that had to be cut. They had to have cultivation. It was you needed thousands and thousands of people to work the land. That's why they needed the slaves. But in order to make sure that the slaves were healthy and also to make sure the slaves were content, they also had to make sure that the families came with them. So that's why they brought the women who then would progenate and have children. And of course, the more children you had, the more slaves you would have for the future. Now, because of that, families were kept together. And of those that came across the Atlantic, only the mortality rate was only 10%. And we've heard about this. This is what comes up in almost every document. Look at the 10% that were killed. Absolutely heinous that they should kill 10%. They didn't kill 10%. These were lost en route. And many times they were lost because of storms, or some of them were even starved. There was terrible. It was no one apologizes for the fact. I mean, we do apologize for the fact that there was a loss. 10% were lost. What's fascinating to me is that no one's asked how much of the percent of those that went through the Islamic slave trade were lost. Take a look at the numbers. 80 to 90% of slaves that went up in the Islamic slave trade, according to what Dr. John Azuma found, were lost. Let me give you an example. He noticed that the reason why only women were needed is because they needed them for sexual slaves, also to take care of the household. There were no plantations in the Middle East that they needed a lot of men for. So they usually killed off the men. That's why this 80 to 90% figure is there. More than that, the only men they really needed were eunuchs to take care of the harims, to take care of the women. Now, in order for them to make sure that they didn't have any problem with them, they castrated them. And what John Azuma found is that 95% of those who were castrated died from their wounds en route. Why haven't we been told this? That's heinous when you stop and think what Islam has done, the history and the testimony of what Islam is concerning humanity. Continue back, you can see the purpose for the Islamic slave trade was mainly sexual. The purpose for transatlantic slave was mainly agricultural. Now, here's where and now we're coming to the material that most Muslims get me upset with. When you look around the world today and you look and see the progeny, the descendants of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade, they still exist today. They're all over the Caribbean. They're all over South America. Brazil has an enormous population of descendants that come from slaves. This country of Haiti is mostly made up of descendants of slaves, Jamaica as well. You come to our country here in the United States, over 30 million descendants. Our last president, his wife, Michelle Obama, is a descendant of slaves. We know where the progeny of these slaves are. We know where they are all over our countries. They dominate our commerce. They're in our television industry. They're in our film industry. They're certainly in our music industry. So we know the descendants live. And though they may not live as well as they would like, and there are still some problems with discrimination and racism, at least we bring it out into the public and we talk about it and we try to wrestle with it. Let's ask the same question of Islam. Where are the descendants of those 17 to 21 million slaves? Now, if they did survive, if they had remained intact, there should be anywhere from 120 to 140 million of them today. Where is that 140 million slaves today? Where are these huge populations of slaves today? Descendants of slaves, sorry, today. Where are they? The fact that we can't find them proves that they were not interested in keeping families of slaves intact. They were seen as nothing more than maidservants and as for sexual exploitation. But their progeny were not permitted to survive. Very few of them have survived, and there are certain, you can see in Libya, and there are some parts of Egypt, and even every once in a while you will see that there are descendants of Arabs enslaved. But the vast majority were killed off. Now, this is the lie that we're not hearing in our history books. And this is why, and I can understand why Muslims get really upset when we talk about this, because it shows that there's a real problem endemic with Islam concerning sexuality, concerning the need for women, but not progeniting those women if they're of the wrong color. Now, when you go down to the next graph, you will see Islamic slave rates. The next graph, graph number or slide number 20.1. Islamic slave rates in Europe. The slavery they didn't just enslave Africans. They also enslaved Europeans. And according to the latest statistics, from Sicily to Italy to Cornwall to England, even up to Baltimore and Ireland, they enslaved Europeans, galley slaves, laborers, and sexual exploitation from the 16th to the 19th century. These were the European slaves. And according to the latest statistics, anywhere from about around 1.25 million Europeans were also enslaved. What you won't find is that they did not enslave other Muslims. They did not enslave other Arabs. They only enslaved Africans and Europeans. And it was America that actually shut down that slave trade in Europe. It was the Marines, and that's why we have it in our Marine Corps hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli is referring to the eradication of slavery by America. It was United States that actually shut down that slavery in the Mediterranean to shut down the white slavery, enslavement. Now, as far as American enslavement, we only know of 130 that were captured. So it didn't really touch the American slavery, yet we were the ones that had to shut it down. What I want to do now is I want to go back to something that's even more contentious. And I want to go back to talk about
Dr. Smith.
This. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, before we do that, we do need to take a short break. I know people are really surprised, and I'm sure a lot of people are amazed at this information that we are presenting in this show. But we do have to take a short break. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes with more Colliding Worldviews and talking more about the hidden Islamic slave trade. One more reason why you need to make sure that you share this video with everyone out there so they can get educated about this practice, which is still happening today.
ABN Set TV Ministries is now a part of Amazon Smile. This means that any purchase you make on their website, Amazon will donate 2% of your total purchase to ABN with no additional cost to yourself. All you have to do is sign up at smile.amazon.com, and after you signed in to your regular Amazon account, just search for our ministry by typing Aramaic Broadcasting Network. Then click Select next to our name, and you're all set to support us. Set up your Amazon Smile account today by selecting Aramaic Broadcasting Network as the group you want to donate to. Be a part of Amazon Smile and help ABN Set TV Ministries grow by having Amazon donate to us whenever you make a purchase on their website.
Now in the palm of your hand is the updated ABN SAD app, so you can now watch all of the programs, shows, and channels in different languages. You can download the app in the App Store related to your device. Once downloaded, you will see 6 different categories within the ABN SAT app. The first category being the English category, which includes 18 different channels. The Arabic category includes 31 channels. The Worship category has 5 channels. The Discipleship category includes 5 channels as well. For more information, please call the numbers on your screen or visit our website at trinitychannel.com.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity Channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. Again, we are in the midst of a 7-week end-of-the-year series with Dr. J. Smith, the Historical Critique series. Today is episode 5 of 7. Yes, 2 more weeks here of more information that we have for you. But we're talking about the hidden Islamic slave trade, and this is amazing information, especially for people out there who have heard that many African Americans convert to Islam, especially in prisons. Of course, many of them are going to the Nation of Islam, which most Sunni Muslims would consider heretical, but nevertheless, many African Americans go to Islam thinking, oh, this is the true religion of our ancestors and all that kind of stuff. But Dr. Smith, what are we talking about in this show?
Well, and let's carry on from this, because this is what we're showing, is that this is anything but the whole Islamic slavery is anything but benign. And the reason we're even bringing this up is because there's something endemic to Islam and slavery, and there's something endemic about the Africans. And what I want to do now is what Sarah did. Sarah then wanted to find out, why is it that Islamic slavery was so brutal? Secondly, was so huge? And thirdly, why is it was primarily generated by African slaves? And she wanted to go back and find out where this all came from. And so she went back to the traditions and to the hadith and to the sunnah of the Prophet, known as the sirah, the hadith, the tafsir, and the takhrij, those genre. And then she went back to the Quran herself. And this is where Dr. John Azuma went back as well. And this is what she has found. So what I want to do is go to slide number 5 and look and see what the traditions tell us concerning the this reference to Muhammad himself. Muhammad, and let's start with him, since he is the paradigm for all Muslims. Muhammad scolds a woman for freeing a slave. We find this in Sahih Bukhari there, but the second one down on the screen there. Hadith told him that she manumitted a slave girl without taking the permission of the Prophet. Manumitted means freeing a slave girl without taking the permission of the Prophet. Allah's prophet, Allah's apostle, said to her, "You would have gotten more reward if you had given her," in other words, a slave girl, to one of your maternal uncles. Sahih Muslim talks about a case where Muhammad re-enslaves a freed slave. Coming down if they are technician, come down to the next reference point there on the screen. Muhammad cancels a manumitted slave. So here you have re-enslaves a freed slave. He emancipated 6 slaves. Muhammad then took and set 2 of them free and kept 4 in slavery. And then he spoke severely against the person for manumitting them. Another case where Muhammad cancels the manumission, cancels the freedom of that slave in Sahih Bukhari. The Prophet canceled the manumission and scolded the slave for him. And then we go into another case in Sahih Bukhari where Muhammad redefines freedom, and he says the freed slave belongs to the people who have freedom. So when you have examples like this of Muhammad himself in their own traditions, not allowing people to even emancipate their slaves, and then coming back and actually taking 4 and then letting 2 free, but taking 4 for himself, and then scolding those who freed slaves. You can see, if this is their example, you can see then why much of this is endemic to Islam. Let's go to slide number 6. In slide number 6, you have reference, and there are many of these references. Sarah only puts up 2 of them here. Al-Tabari, who is the first and most authoritative of the tafsir, the compilations, the commentaries that really unpack the Quran. It talks about Arabs, and it says Arabs are the most noble people in lineage, the most prominent, and the best in deeds. And we won't have to read the rest. You can read it there on the screen. But what this is saying is that there is a view in the Muslim world that Arabs are superior to everybody else. Ibn Taymiyyah even says this. And when he's talking about Aisha, Muhammad said to Aisha, "Set this maid free because she is from the children of Ishmael." He would not allow that Arab to be enslaved because she's an Arab. And because she's an Arab, she must by right be free. Now, we're going to now look at some of probably the household names of Islam and what they said about African people. When I came across this material, when Sarah introduced it to me about 2 years ago, and when I read it, it bothered me enormously. And it will bother some of you who are going to hear this, especially Muslims. And I'd like our technician to put up slide number 7, looking at reference after reference after reference of the household names of Islam. These are men of God. These are people that any Muslim who's watching this show will recognize. And you look at the graph up there. This is Al-Jahiz, Al-Qutayba, Al-Tabari, Al-Muqaddasi, Ibn Sina, Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khaldun. You know these names. These are names I've had to study for the last 35 years. These are the names that everybody talks about. These, if the equivalent in Christianity would be the Calvins, these are the Martin Luthers, these are the Augustines of Christianity. These are the great men of God. They should know more than any other because they should have, but they had the scriptures at their disposal. They are the ones that interpret scriptures for Muslims today. Look and see what they say concerning African people. Let's start with some of the quotes, and these are straight quotes from their own literature. Al-Jahiz, a famous Muslim scholar who died in 869, said that like the crow among mankind are the Zunj. Zunj are African blacks. The word Zunj in Arabic is African blacks. For they are the worst of men and the most vicious of creatures in character and in temperament. We know that the Zunj are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind, and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. He goes on and says, the Shu'abiya, which is the group of Africans that he's referring to, maintain that eloquence is prized by all people at all times, even the Zunj, despite their dimness and boundless stupidity. Their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions make long speeches, really ridiculing the Zunj among them. Ibn Qutayba lived in the 9th century again. He died in the late 9th century. He said, black people are ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country. Hopeless, terrible things that you hear about them. Let's continue on down to Al-Muqaddasi, who died in 1000 AD. Muqaddasi said, of the neighbors of the Buja, the Maqdisi had heard that there is no marriage among them, and the child does not know his father, and they eat people, but God knows best. As for the Zunj, they are people of black color, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence. Now, how many of you have heard these kind of quotes before? I had never heard about this before. We were not taught this. This was never brought up in any of our books when I grew up went to school. This was unheard of, and yet Sarah and Dr. John Azuma have been coming across these quotes. Ibn Sina, we've all know, he's a household name, says that blacks are people who are by their very nature slaves. In other words, they are meant to be slaves. Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, a Shiite Muslim scholar and Grand Ayatollah, died in 1274, says of all types of men are taken from the first and one place after another, like the Negro from Zanzibar on the East Coast. In the southernmost countries, the Negro does not differ from an animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted from the earth. In no other peculiarity or property except for what God wished. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro and more intelligent. I mean, it's even hard for me to read this stuff. To me, it's filthy. You can see why this is not brought into our school books. But why is it we've not been told that men like Al-Tusi, one of the most celebrated Shiite Muslim scholars, Grand Ayatollah in 1274, would say things like this about Africans? Ibn Khaldun, another household name, an Islamist jurist, lawyer, scholar, theologian, and Hafiz, died in 1406, said, therefore, the Negro nation are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. Beyond known peoples of Black West Africa to the south, there is no civilization in the proper sense. There are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. They live in thickets and caves and eat herbs and unprepared grain. They frequently eat each other. They cannot be considered human beings. I mean, to me, it just reels as I'm reading this. To me, it's hard. I don't even like to have to even go into this. And that's why it's sad that these have yet to be apologized for. No one's really read them before. We're the first to bring it out into the open. Let's go on, Tony, and let's look at colorism, because this is something that Sarah has been focusing in on. And she brought up into the open this idea of the black color. Now, when you start with the black color, I'm going to jump to the next slide, to slide number 9, because when you get into colorism, now let's look at that slide that you have up there. Thanks for putting it up. The Arabs are sometimes described themselves as black in contrast to Persians, who are red, but at other times as red and white in contrast to Africans, who are black. During the period immediately following the death of the Prophet in 632, a new situation was created, narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color term applied to human beings. A very clear connotation of inferiority was attached to the darker and more specific to black skins. So this is coming from Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis is saying, a very well-known scholar from Princeton University, said that this idea of blackness, this idea of coloration, was introduced with Islam. It was Muslims who started making this distinction, the black versus other colors. Now, going down to the Quran, and I like to bring up the Quran at this time because you have two verses in the Quran that really suggest this. One is the Surah Ayah 3, chapter 3, Ayah 106. If we could bring up slide number 9 here. And here you can see these two verses that are well known. We brought them up at Speaker's Corner. Muslims have tried to attack them. The first verse, chapter 3, verse 106, or Surah 3, Ayah 106, on the day of resurrection, when some faces will become white and some faces will become black. As for those whose faces will become black, to them will be said, did you reject faith after accepting it? Then taste the torment in hell for rejecting faith. Now, I don't know how you can look at that verse any other way than looking and seeing that the assumption there is that the people that go to heaven have white faces, the people that go to hell have black faces. Making this distinction of good versus bad, good being white, bad being black. Chapter 39, verse 60, Surah 39, verse 60, and on the day of resurrection, you will see those who lied about Allah with their faces blackened. Is there not a hell in resident for the arrogant? So if you lie, your faces are turned or become black. So this idea of coloration is introduced in the Quran itself, suggesting that black is evil, white is good. And you can see then why then you get to the traditions. Now you go, if you go to slide number 10, because there you get coloration that's coming out in the traditions. Bukhari talks about that you should listen to and obey your ruler, even if he is an Ethiopian slave whose head looks like a raisin. The suggestion there is not only heinous, it's downright, it's downright wrong. Well, Sunan An-Nasi 4185. The prophet said, sell him to me, and he bought him for 2 black slaves. So this one person is equal to 2 black slaves. So you can see that this idea of black people being half an importance as someone who's not black is on the lips of the prophet himself. Ibn Majah goes on to, he says, do not marry women for their beauty, which may destroy them, or for their money, which may corrupt them for religion. A slit-nosed black slave woman if pious, is preferable, assuming that somehow that is the worst of the categories for women, being black-nosed, black-faced. Ibn Hazm in 1064 says, God has decreed that the most devout is the noblest, even if he is a negress bastard, and that the sinner and unbeliever is at the lowest level, even if he is a son of the prophet. So idea that even if he's a bastard, that's the worst thing you can think of, he's still, if he is pious, he's noble. Fascinating that they would use this kind of language. Jami al-Timirdi, Ibn Abbas narrated that the black stone, that's the stone that's in the Kaaba right now, descended from paradise, and it was more white than milk. Then it was blackened by sin, that sin created this blackness of the stone itself. And then Tirmidhi goes on to say, Allah created Adam when he had to create him and struck his right shoulder, and there emitted from it white offspring, as if they were white ants. He struck his left shoulder, and there emitted from it the black offspring, as if they were charcoal. He then said to those who had been emitted from the right shoulder, for paradise I do not mind. Then he said to those who were emitted from the left shoulder, they are for hell, I do not mind. Now remember, these are traditions, but can you see this kind of attitude? If you see it in the traditions, and this is what creates Islam today, you cannot understand Islam without going to Tirmidhi or Ibn Majah. You have to go to Bukhari, Muslim. These are the ones that are giving us the sayings of the Prophet himself. If this is what Muhammad believed, if this is what they said, if this is what the great men of God were like, then you can understand why this view of coloration is endemic to Islam, is part and parcel of the DNA of Islam. Let's now look at what Muhammad looked like. And this is fascinating. Sarah put this graph together. I just want to show it to you. Slide number 11. Muhammad's appearance. When you look at Muhammad's appearance, when you look at what Al-Bukhari says, that Muhammad was a white man. So Al-Bukhari even referred to him as a white man. According to Ibn Dawud, that he had a white forearm. According to Al-Bukhari, he had a white abdomen and belly. According to Al-Bukhari again, he had white legs. He had white shanks. According to Sahih Muslim, he had handsome white face. According to Al-Bukhari, he even had white armpits. And then according to Al-Adab al-Mufra, that he had white skin. And then according to Bukhari, that he was not really completely white, but he was white. This reference over and over again that Muhammad had to have been white, that his legs, his shanks, his skin, his face Even his armpits were white. And then Ibn Musa al-Yasunbi says, anyone who says that the prophet was black should be killed. So to even refer that, even intimate that Muhammad could have been black, they should be killed for that. Can you then understand why then this idea of blackness was something that was introduced, that this evil? Let's go to slide number 12. Ibn Dawud talks about the fact that black dogs must be killed because they are evil. Kill every pure black one. Going on to kill the jet black ones because they are more mischievous. Sahih Muslim refers to this thing that the black dog is like a devil. When we go back to Al-Bukhari, coming on down, volume number 9, book 87, if we could bring it down just a bit. Al-Bukhari, we're going much quicker here because you can read these on your own time. They're up there on your screen. Go back and you can see them. But according to Al-Bukhari, it says that black women cause epidemics. The prophet said, I saw in a dream a black woman who with unkempt hair going out of the Medina and settling in Mahia. I interpreted that as a epidemic of Medina being transferred to Mahia, namely Al-Hujjah. So even Muhammad thought that black women brought about epidemics, brought a sickness. And then finally, he says, according to Sunnah al-Nasai, that Jabir said, Abu Khafa was brought to the day of the conquest by Malika, and his hair and beard were white like a thagama. And the messenger of God, that means Muhammad, said, change this with something, but avoid black. Anything but black. So you can see these references all going back to the tradition. Now, Bernard Lewis, let's go to the next slide. Bernard Lewis brings this up. And he says that the Arabs sometimes describe themselves as black in contrast to Persians, who are red, but at other times as red or white in contrast with Africans. The characteristic color of the Bedouin is variously stated as olive or brown. During this period, Bernard Lewis says, immediately following the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, the great Islamic conquest took the new faith to vast areas of Asia and Africa. A new situation was created. And many changes can be observed in the literature of that time. So when you look at the literature, you will see, he says, the first of these is the narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color terms applied to human beings. So they started making and saying, this person's red, this person's yellow, this person's brown, and this person is black. In time, almost all disappear apart from black, red, and white. And these become ethnic and absolute instead of personal and relative. Together with this specialization of fixing of color terms comes a very clear connotation of inferiority attached to darker and more specifically black skins. So Lewis is saying that this was all introduced by Islam and made the specialization of one color with another was very much part of that. When we look at the attitudes in the early Islamic literature, you will see this. Looking at slide number 14, look at this, and you can see that the Africans of that time, an African origin poet named Suhaim in 660. Now, this is 30 years after Muhammad died. Look and see what he says. If my color were pink, he says, women would love me. But the Lord has marred me with blackness. Though I am a slave, my soul is nobly free. Though I am black of color, my character is white. I am covered with a black garment, he says, but under there is a lustrous garment with white skirts. You can see he's agonizing as he realizes how terrible he must be because he's being black. Where's he getting this idea that he's terrible? Well, obviously from all the literature, from everything he's hearing, from the prophet's own lips. Another black poet, Abu Dalama, a father of blackness known today in 768, is probably the best known early black poet in Arabic literature, a slave who became a court jester during the first Abbasid caliphs, said this: we are alike in color, our faces are black and ugly, our names are shameful. And Jahiz of Basra in 869, one of the greatest prose writers in classical Arabic literature and may be partly of African descent, in a special essay called The Boast of the Blacks Against Whites, he said this: it is part of your ignorance that in the time of heathendom, that means before Islam, that's the Jahiliyyah period, you regarded us blacks as good enough to marry your women. Yet when the justice of Islam came, you considered this wrong. So this all came about because of Islam. We were okay. We could even marry your women. Oh, I'm sorry, this direction, back there in the Jahiliyyah period. But once Islam came, then we could no longer marry your women. And I see that we need to keep going. So let's jump now to slide number 18. Bernard Lewis picks this up and he says, the myth of Islamic racial innocence was a Western creation and served a Western purpose, he was saying. So what he's saying is basically this whole idea of the innocence of Islam was brought out after the Enlightenment. He goes on to say in the 18th century, so we're talking about the 1900s, I'm sorry, the 1700s, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, it's the Enlightenment, had praised Islam for its lack of dogmas and mysteries, its freedom from priests and malignant inquisitors and other persecutors, recognizing real qualities but exaggerating them as a polemical weapon against Christian church and the clergy. That's what they wanted. They wanted to go against the church and the clergy. And so what you can see what's happening here is because of that, he says, going on to David Goldenberg, Lewis did not find any black sentiment in Arabia until the 7th century conquest of Africa and enslavement of its inhabitants. Snowden and Thompson, who also did research on this, similarly did not find a prejudiced view of blacks in ancient Greece or Rome. In these earlier times, color did not define a person. These were not known in early literature, especially during the Greeks and the Roman times. We first see this explicit link between skin color and slavery in Near Eastern sources beginning in the 7th century. We note its first appearance in the Christian West. When it came to the Christian West, as soon as the Europeans discovered Black Africa and began to engage in the slave trade in the 1400s, so the 15th century. So this idea of black being evil, about black being denigrated to be less than human, that was all introduced by Islam. And it was introduced in the 7th century, Bernard's saying, and so is Thompson. And so is the other scholars. Fascinating that it is Islam that brings this coloration in. So let's now go to, and we'll end off with this, slide number 21. Why? The questions we need to ask. And this is what we need to ask our Muslims who are watching this show. Why did Islamic thought borrow from sectarian Jewish and apocryphal writing? Why did the advent of Islam bring about the fixing of color terms for human beings? Why did Muhammad cancel the manumission of some freed slaves? What caused the Zanj, the Africans, to rebel in the 7th century under the rule of the second best generation of Islam? And if Islam came to abolish slavery, when did that abolition begin? And why are Muslim countries the last to eradicate slavery? We don't know of one abolition movement in any Islamic country. All the abolition that came about was imposed on them from outside. So therefore, would you follow this example of Muhammad and take slaves if the circumstances satisfied it? Well, I'm going to go to slide number 22. We'll do a comparison now, because when you look at the comparison between Christianity and Islam, you will see on slide 22 that Christianity, the narrative there is that we go from slavery to freedom. In Islam, the narrative there is that we go from slavery to slavery. You stay in slavery. In Christianity, it's voluntary. You voluntarily, you either become a slave or you are a slave to Christ. In Islam, it's involuntary. You're imposed upon you. And that's why you see it's still happening even today by those pictures that we showed earlier. In Christianity, we have freedom in Yahweh, as was always the plan. In Islam, slaves to Allah was always the plan. In Christianity, Jesus did not trade or own slaves. Nowhere do we see an example of that. In Islam, Muhammad traded and owned slaves. In Christianity, Jesus set the world free. In Islam, Muhammad bought more slaves than he freed. He did free one. We know of Bilal, one slave he freed, but he bought many more and sometimes just grabbed them from others who were trying to free them. In Christianity, our freedom was costly. In Islam, freedom is mere monetary value. In Christianity, God himself fought for our freedom, whereas in Islam, Muhammad fought to capture slaves. When you look at the slave trade, and this is where we can wrap it up today. When you look at the slave trade, look at over on this side, Christians, or not Christian slave trade, let me rephrase it, the Atlantic slave trade. Obviously, these were Christian nations that were involved in it for 1,400 years, from 1,400 to 1,800. That's 400 years of slavery. They enslaved anywhere from 11 to 12 million, and then eradicated it. And the reason they eradicated over here was because of the Bible itself, because of verses like Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, and the book of Philemon. When you look over in this side, slavery over here started in the 7th century and continued and still continues today for 1,400 years. 21 million slaves versus 12 million slaves. 80 to 90% of the slaves that were enslaved died either en route or before they even went. In this case, only 10% died. We don't see the progeny for the slavery over here. We don't see the progeny for the Islamic slave. Where are their descendants? There should be 140 million of them. We do see the descendants for the Atlantic slave trade. They're all over the Middle East. I'm sorry, they're all over Central America, South America, the Caribbean, even North America. And so when you do a comparison, you will see that this is the big elephant that is in the room that no one wants to talk about. That's why we're bringing it up. It is difficult for Muslims to hear. The great thing about it is that Christianity eradicates slavery. Christianity is the only religion that has eradicated slavery. It is Christians who are at the forefront of the abolition movement. Men like William Gill Wilberforce in the Clapham sect. And it's because of the Bible that you also can be freed. And it's only because of the Bible that you have this abolition and this idea that we are not slaves to man, we are only slaves to Jesus Christ.
Amen. Dr. Smith, it's been a blessing to have you back once again for a very important topic that people need to be aware of. We see that the life of Jesus Christ himself, we read in the Bible, we see that all people are made in the image of God. They have intrinsic value. If there were Christians throughout history who had slaves, that is in spite of biblical teachings, not because of it, is not the teachings of Christ. On the other hand, we see that Muhammad owned slaves. We see this whole thing about black and white and him being considered white compared to black people. A lot of problems there. And of course, we see a lot of history of slavery in Islam. And again, that is still continuing today. Huge, huge problem. And people need to be aware of this. We see Muslims who are leaving Islam because of the problems with the Quran, the problems with archaeology that destroys Islam, the traditional worldview at least. We see the problems with so many things we've already talked about in this series. We see many Christians out there sharing the gospel with Muslims, and therefore Muslims are leaving Islam because of that. Jesus is visiting Muslims in dreams. They're leaving Islam because of that. And how vital is it for Muslims to get this information? We know there'd be more Muslims leaving Islam because of this, because, hey, this is the root of your entire religion. We see the political Islamists who are trying to work with racial minorities, saying, hey, you know, Islam, we stick up for your minority rights. Well, Islam has only been focused on minority rights when it was the minority. But when it came to the majority, there were no minority rights. So people need to be informed about all this information. Dr. Smith, we're so thankful to have you here in the 7-week series. 2 more Mondays left of vital information. So please take this episode, share it with everyone, just like all the past episodes. Check those out if you haven't seen them yet. Again, Trinity Channel's YouTube channel, Fander Films YouTube channel, my Vimeo channel. You'll be able to find all of these videos and more. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for being with us once again.
God bless you. Thank you, Tony.
We will see you next Monday. And folks, we will see you next Monday as well. In the meantime, God bless you. Share these videos and go and reach Muslims with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. God bless you and good night.